This is the last session of the module titled, Is the Bible Consistent? I think it's important to establish everything we've covered so far. The New Testament was originally transmitted through oral histories for a few short years after Jesus' life. Within a single lifetime, those stories were compiled into written testimonies by the biblical authors. Those writings were carefully copied many thousands of times over the years, and it was that work that has allowed scholars today to reconstruct the original Bible. It's misguided to think that our Bible is even marginally different from the original. We already know about the rare exceptions to this, and scholars are totally transparent about those few examples.
Nice summary, Jake. It's really amazing to think about how accurate our Bible is to the original and how confident we can be in its accuracy. Now that we've established that the Bible is accurate, there's one last thing we need to take a look at. Are there any contradictions?
We need to be gracious here because this is an area where Christians may have a variety of views. In the last few sections, we looked at the objective evidence that builds a strong case for the Bible's accuracy. But here, we have to entertain different theories about how Christians see the Bible. The bottom line is that there are a number of views here that all walk away with the conclusion that the Bible can be trusted.
Another point to maybe set some expectations for this session is that we can't possibly go case by case and resolve every single alleged contradiction in the Bible. There are way too many examples that people have challenged the Bible with over the years. So, Denise, why don't you walk us through some of these views and we can cover the examples as they come up?
The first one most people automatically assume is that the Bible simply doesn't have any contradictions, or rather that the contradictions are only apparent, meaning they only seem like contradictions until we know the truth that makes them consistent.
I have a relevant example here from Scripture that we could use to discuss this view. In the Gospels, there's a famous story in which Jesus is dining with a man named Simon, and a woman interrupts their dinner and anoints him with perfume. This story is in all four Gospels, and it comes with an absolute litany of accusations. In Luke, the host is a Pharisee, but in the other Gospels, he's a leper. The location is either Capernaum in the north or a southern village called Bethany. The time this occurs is on separate days of the year and a couple of smaller contradictions. How would someone resolve this as an apparent contradiction?
Well, there's at least one easy answer. They are simply telling two different stories, which is fairly plausible. For example, there are something like 12 different Simons in Scripture. So it's possible that there could have been both a leper and a Pharisee with the same name. Also, Jesus' main lesson in Luke was about forgiveness, and his main lesson in the other Gospels was foretelling his death. Another important point is that the later Gospels had access to the earlier ones. So it's interesting that Luke, for example, was not even trying to match the details with the other Gospels. It's very plausible that he's just reporting an entirely different event rather than the same one. Here's another quick example of a contradiction that's only apparent. In Mark 10:46 and Luke 18:35, we read about Jesus healing a blind man. In Mark, Jesus is arriving at a town named Jericho. In Luke, though, Jesus is leaving Jericho. There are a couple resolutions to this, but most likely it's just simple geography. In those days, a lot of towns were actually a pretty spread out region of buildings, shops, and neighborhoods. So there might have been a cluster of buildings on the road, and then just a little later, another cluster, and the whole area would have been called Jericho. So Jesus could have been coming out of one cluster called Jericho and into another. In other words, Mark and Luke could both be right.
That's one way contradictions in the Bible could be handled. It seems to me that there's a response to every single challenge that's ever been brought. So I'd encourage everyone to do their own research. Denise, tell us about another way we can handle contradictions.
Well, a second view would still say that there are no contradictions in the Bible, but only if you judge it by its own standards.
You're not saying that we should lower our standards when we read the Bible, right? You just mean that we are supposed to read the Bible on its own standards.
Exactly. And this method requires that we keep the Gospels in the first century context and read them as if they were oral histories that had been written down. The thing about oral histories is that there obviously would have been some amount of variation in the story based on who was telling it, but there was always a socially accepted norm that in each retelling, details could vary between 10 and 40%. If the story deviated too much, the orator would get corrected and the story would be brought back in line with popular consensus. A scholar by the name of Craig Blomberg has pointed out that that's roughly the amount of difference you'll find between any of the four Gospels.
So if we read the Gospels like it was written by four orators who are writing down an oral history, it's within the accepted norms to be called consistent. Are there any other cultural insights that would change the way we view the Gospels?
Sure. A big one is how they understood storytelling. Virtually every story told today is told in chronological order. Maybe you can think of a few movies that jump around in the timeline, and those are sometimes thought of as strange and hard to understand. But the biblical authors would tell most of their stories in nonlinear fashion. They would advance the story by sticking to the theme with any relevant information, regardless of when it happened. As an example, the Gospel of Mark is notorious for using the word immediately. He uses the word something like 35 times. But when it says immediately Jesus went to this place, if we read that with a first century lens, maybe that wasn't the exact next step in the timeline, but it is the immediate next part of Mark's story. So the Gospels aren't necessarily all linear, but it's also important to realize that they share complementary perspectives.
Okay, so we've briefly mentioned before that the different gospels may have had slightly different target audiences and motivations for writing. Why don't you tell us more about those complementary perspectives?
As a quick example, Matthew was writing to Jews and Luke to Gentiles and John to an increasingly pluralistic world. They also would have had a different side to Jesus that they thought their audience needed to hear about. So we should allow them to emphasize some events and minimize other events based on their target audience.
That seems pretty straightforward, but how does that help us resolve contradictions?
An example would be the Lord's Prayer, which occurs in Matthew 6 and Luke 11. These are two different versions of the same prayer, but we could read that section and understand that the authors have two complementary perspectives. Another example would be Jesus' final words on the cross. The different Gospels report a different final statement. My God, why have you forsaken me? In Matthew and Mark. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit in Luke. And it is finished in John.
It's interesting in your first example that two Christians could resolve that contradiction differently. The apparent contradiction person might have to conclude that there were two different versions of the Lord's Prayer, taught at different times. But a cultural standards person might be comfortable with the fact that Matthew and Luke just chose to record it differently.
That's really the main point about this entire section. We can't possibly go through all the alleged contradictions in the Bible. We can't tell you which theory to believe. In fact, we can't even cover all the different viewpoints on this. What we can do, though, is make a compelling case that there are a variety of Christians with a variety of views who all trust the Bible. This concludes Module 4, where we examined whether the Bible is consistent. Overall, we found our modern versions of the Bible are very accurate to the original. Its preservation over 2,000 years pushes us to think the Bible's accuracy defies natural explanation. In the next module, we're going to examine whether the Bible can really be called a moral standard of conduct.